Having examined those consequentialist theories, we're now going to turn to the deontological based approach to determining whether an act or decision or behaviour is ethical or not. There's a couple of ways we're going to approach this, and the first is actually a classic deontological approach, and it comes from a guy called Immanuel Kant. So he came at a period in time when morally we were often told what to do, particularly in European terms, which is the tradition that he comes from. We were told to do what by the church or the priest, etc. No one had really thought through, how do we determine whether something's morally right or wrong? We just kind of did what we were told. So Kant was coming about to say, well, maybe we can work this out on our own. And so what he came up with was a way to determine, based upon rationality, whether something is ethical or not. So why don't we hop into it? The example that we have before us here is to really one way to think about the logic that Kant's starting to apply in his approach to ethics. So imagine that you discover your company has been overpaying one of your suppliers, and they've overpaid it to the amount of 50 grand. Now, really consequentially, the same thing has occurred, right? There's an amount of $50,000 that has been overpaid. But in one case, we can see that there's some fraud on behalf of the senior accountant who was paying them and probably getting a kickback. In the second, however, it's just a mistake, right? That we've inadvertently been overpaying the invoices that have been set in. Really the question, one of the advantages of Kant's approach is that it's trying to differentiate between these two scenarios. Rather than saying whether they're morally equivalent, right, he actually looks to the will of the person involved. Right, so he's looking at what did the senior accountant think? What was their motivation? And because he comes from a long time ago, they tend to use some old world words. What was their will or their motivation? So obviously in the first one, the motivation was it lacked morality, right, being fraudulent. In the second one, there was no lack of morality. It was just a mistake. And so Kant is trying to differentiate these two kinds of situations because a consequentialist theory might not actually come up with a way of distinguishing between the two if the impact was the same of that $50,000. And so we can distinguish the Kantian approach to ethics by looking at the will, whether the behaviour could be considered unethical irrespective of the consequences, because our utilitarianism may say that the impact was actually the same, or the pleasure and pain for all the parties would even itself out and there is no difference. So if we want to get at this will or this motivation behind the decision, we need a different way of thinking about it. And that's where Immanuel Kant comes in. The idea of having a good will or a moral motivation or intention. Sometimes it's called duty. So when we think about duty, it's about this moral motivation and intention, that we have a duty to do things a certain way because that's the right way to do it. Now, Kant was very particular, saying that actions can only be considered moral or ethical when they're motivated by morality, when there is a goodwill behind them. And that goodwill determines whether it's ethical or not. The consequences don't matter. So he's ignoring the consequentialist approach and saying it's about what you do. This provides us with a moral duty to do the right thing, irrespective of what happens. So even if we're getting continually bad consequences, you can still be acting morally if the goodwill is there. This is also called that deontological approach, that term that we've been using thus far. So the question becomes, how do we work out what our moral duties are? Kant was very big, right, on the idea that humans are rational, that we can be deliberate, follow rules, we can make free choices. And as rational beings, we have to act in accordance with that rationality. So that means a moral person will be someone who is not inconsistent or contradictory in what they do. That links back to last week when we were talking about the role of integrity, acting in accordance with the principles, irrespective of the situation that you're in. It's kind of relativism, anti-ethical relativism, if you think about it that way. Okay, so you're going to act consistent. You're not going to be inconsistent or contradictory. The other major thing is that we've got to act in a way that respects our rationality. Okay, so we can't do things that deny our nature as rational beings. That's really important, right? We'll come across this in a minute, but it means treating people with respect, because people can make free choices. So we have to respect that about them and allow them to actually make those free choices. If we don't, then it won't be a moral act. So as rational beings, we have this duty to follow these two principles. Kant used this big term, categorical imperative, to describe it. Think of it this way. Categorical refers to the category, right? So the category can be that something is ethical or it's not. Okay, so we want the category to be that it's ethical. So we can look at every act and say it either fits in the category of being ethical or not. And an imperative, well, that's what we must do. Okay. So really by the categorical imperative, he's saying that's what we ethically must do. It's this absolute duty that we have in all situations, irrespective of the circumstances. Now he had three key formulations around this. We're going to deal with the first two. The first one is something meets the categorical imperative when everyone can do it all the time. Okay, so it's something that everyone must do in every particular circumstance. If it doesn't meet that standard, then it doesn't meet the standard of universal acceptability. The second formulation was respect. So you've got to treat other people as a person, not as a means to an end. Okay, so you've got to treat people with respect. Let's look a bit deeper at these two formulations. In order to look at the two formulations, what we have to do is have a proposed course of action to test against them. And to do this, Kant came up with the idea of a maxim. Okay, so a maxim is merely a kind of generalized statement of your behavior or decision that you're going to make. Okay, so here we have one from business. I will breach contracts whenever this increases my profit. Okay, so imagine a situation where you are contractually bound to do something in a very specific circumstance. So I'm contractually bound to bring you a coffee every morning for $10, and we have a contract in place for that. And I think, actually, I could sell that coffee for $12. So I'm going to breach my contract to you for $10 and sell it for $12. Now, a maxim is not, I should always breach a contract for selling coffee, right? That's too particular. The maxim is an extraction, a generalized step back from that into this general rule that we're trying to apply. So a typical maxim would be something like, I will breach contracts whenever this increases my profits. So then Kant says, well, we need to even universalize that further and say, if it's going to meet the categorical imperative, then it means that everyone will breach contracts all the time whenever that increases their profits. Now we have to ask, look, is that statement, is that maxim consistent or contradictory? Okay. Well, the answer is it's actually quite contradictory. If people would breach contracts whenever it increased their profit, then contracts won't be binding. So a contract becomes nonsensical in that sense. So really a contradiction, this is called a contradiction in conception, is really saying the statement becomes illogical if it's applied all the time. Okay, so let's take the case of lying. That's the classic approach of Kant. And Kant would say you should never lie. And just say, well, okay, I should be able to lie in certain situations. Well, if everyone could lie in certain situations, then it would mean that truth is meaningless. Okay, because if you're allowed to lie, then truth has no meaning. So this is the contradiction in conception that Kant is talking about. All of this discussion about the whether something is universally applicable ignores the consequences of breaching a contract, right? So it's got nothing to do with the consequences. It's about the act or the duty. Now, as well as a contradiction in conception, what we can have is what's called a contradiction in will. Okay. So a contradiction in will is something that's subtly different. Sometimes we could universally apply a particular maxim and it would still be logical, but people might not want to live in a world like that. So take the maxim, I should never give to charity. Okay, so there's nothing illogical about that. But as a rational human, would we want to live in a world where there was no charity? If no one ever gave money to anyone, to anyone else ever? Probably we wouldn't want to live in a world like that. That would be considered a contradiction in will. So if we have either a contradiction in conception or a contradiction in will, then what we find is that we can't meet the categorical imperative, and therefore that proposed act is not moral or ethical. So we've got a different example here about a contradiction in will. Imagine that you're thinking you're going to exploit your customers to increase profits. Okay, there doesn't seem to be anything contradictory in terms of logic there. But if we universalize it, everyone will exploit their customers in order to increase profits. That means, that means I am going to be a customer at some point. I'm going to be a customer of someone else. Would I want to live in a world where I'm being exploited? Okay, so probably not. So again, that's a contradiction in will. The second of the formulations of the categorical imperative that we apply is that we've got to treat humanity or people with respect, not as a means to an end. Okay, so not as a means to an end. Now, look, we can, for instance, get served by someone in a restaurant, which is where we are treating them as a means to get our dinner, but we also need to do that in a way that's respectful, right? They choose to be there as part of that process and get paid for it. So that's not really using them in the Kantian sense. In a general business setting, right, selling goods to a customer is doing something to make a profit, which is the aim of business. So yes, but as long as we're doing that in a respectful way, and respectful is often talking about the free will that we know that people have. We go right back to the beginning. One of the core principles for Kant is this idea of rationality. Rationality involves free will. So when you're selling to a customer, are they reasonably informed? Right? If they're not reasonably informed, then you're not treating them with respect and therefore breaching the second categorical imperative. Look, Kant can be a bit difficult to understand, so it's really important that you have a go and try and apply it to some different situations, and perhaps have a look at some of the examples that you can find in the readings or also via YouTube. There's often many good ways of explaining Kant's approach. As with all ethical approaches, there are positives to it and there are negatives. In Kant's ethical approach, well, really the major criticism is that it's really too strict. So if we universalize lying to be contradictory, then something like lying is never acceptable. So that means even if you're going to save someone's life, you shouldn't lie. And that's a very kind of strict test, and the consequences of that test are dire. So a lot of people would argue that strictly following Kant's approach does not always lead to the most ethical outcome. Similarly, it also doesn't help you when you've got two conflicting duties or two conflicting rules that approach. So I ought not to lie and I ought not to let someone be killed. How do I resolve those two? Which of those two am I going to follow? And so actually trying to move Kant's ideas into the real world becomes quite difficult. The only way we can do it is start providing exceptions. And as soon as we have exceptions, then we find, well, that breaches the universality element of Kant's approach. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an introduction to the first of our deontological approaches. In the next approach, we're going to have a look at the idea of duties or codes.